In 1898, an American battleship exploded in a harbor in Cuba. 266 sailors died. Nobody knew exactly why. But within weeks, newspapers across America were screaming for war, and a few months later, the United States had defeated a 400-year-old empire and gained colonies on the other side of the planet. This is the story of how a mysterious explosion, a sensational press, and a small island nation's fight for freedom pulled America onto the world stage for the first time. This is the Spanish-American War, explained. To understand how this war started, we have to go back further than most people realize. By the late 1800s, Spain was a shadow of what it had once been. 300 years earlier, the Spanish Empire controlled huge parts of the Americas, from Mexico to Argentina. But by the 1890s, that empire had shrunk to just a handful of colonies: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and the small Pacific island of Guam. Spain was clinging on to what was left, and Cuba was the crown jewel of what remained. It sat just 90 miles from Florida, lush and tropical, with rich sugar plantations that generated enormous wealth. For Spain, losing Cuba wasn't just a political blow. It would mean the symbolic end of an empire that once spanned the globe. But Cuba's own people had other plans. They had been fighting for independence on and off since the 1860s, in a brutal conflict known as the 10 Years' War. That war ended without independence, but the desire for freedom never went away. In 1895, a second war of independence broke out. One of its most important leaders was a writer and revolutionary named José Martí. Martí spent years in exile in the United States, building support for the Cuban cause, only to be killed in battle shortly after the uprising began. His death turned him into a martyr, and his writings became the ideological backbone of the independence movement. Spain's response to the rebellion was ruthless. The Spanish government sent General Valeriano Weyler to crush the uprising, and his methods were horrifying even by the standards of the time. Weyler introduced what was called a reconcentration policy, forcing Cuban civilians out of the countryside and into fortified camps and towns, supposedly to cut off support for the rebels. In reality, these camps became death traps. With little food, clean water, or medical care, disease spread quickly. Historians estimate that tens of thousands, possibly more than 100,000 Cuban civilians, died in these camps from starvation and illness. News of these conditions started reaching the United States, and it horrified the American public. And this is where the story takes an interesting turn, because 4,000 miles away, in New York City, two newspaper publishers were locked in a fierce rivalry, and Cuba became their battlefield too. Joseph Pulitzer ran the New York World. William Randolph Hearst ran the New York Journal. Both men were fighting for readers in one of the most competitive newspaper markets in the world, and they discovered that nothing sold papers like outrage. This led to a style of reporting that became known as yellow journalism: sensationalized, exaggerated, sometimes outright fabricated stories designed to provoke an emotional reaction. Cuban atrocities were reported in vivid, dramatic detail, sometimes accurately, sometimes wildly exaggerated. Illustrations depicted Spanish soldiers as monstrous villains. Sympathy for Cuban rebels grew across the United States, fueled by these front-page stories. It wasn't only newspapers shaping American opinion, though. There were real financial interests at stake. American businesses had invested tens of millions of dollars in Cuban sugar production, and instability on the island threatened those investments directly. So you had a combination of genuine humanitarian concern, sensationalized media coverage, and financial self-interest, all pushing American public opinion toward intervention. Americans were being fed a steady diet of outrage. All they needed was a spark. And on February 15, 1898, they got one. In January of that year, the United States sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor. Officially, this was described as a goodwill visit, a friendly gesture during a tense time. In reality, it was a show of force, a signal to Spain that the United States was watching closely and was prepared to act if American lives or interests were threatened. The Maine sat anchored in Havana Harbor for several weeks without incident. Then, on the night of February 15, 1898, at 9:40 in the evening, the Maine exploded. The blast tore through the front of the ship, and it sank within minutes. 266 of the 354 crew members aboard were killed, most of them instantly. It was one of the deadliest peacetime disasters the U.S. Navy had ever experienced, and almost immediately, Americans assumed the worst, that Spain had planted a mine and deliberately attacked the ship. Hearst's New York Journal ran the headline that would define the moment. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." It spread across the country and became the rallying cry for a nation that was already primed for war. Here's something interesting, though. The real cause of the explosion remained a mystery for decades. Several investigations were conducted over the following century, and in 1976, a thorough study led by Admiral Hyman Rickover concluded that the most likely explanation wasn't Spanish sabotage at all. It was probably an internal fire in a coal bunker that spread and ignited the ship's ammunition magazine, a tragic accident rather than an attack. But in 1898, nobody had this information. The American public believed Spain was responsible, and at that point, the truth almost didn't matter anymore. The narrative had already taken hold, and the country was ready for action. President William McKinley, somewhat surprisingly, did not want war. He understood the risks and tried to avoid military conflict if possible. But the pressure on him was enormous. Congress was pushing for action. The press was demanding it. The public had been swept up in a wave of aggressive nationalism that historians call jingoism, an intense, often reckless desire to prove American strength on the world stage. Spain actually tried to de-escalate the situation, agreeing to several American demands, including ending the reconcentration camps. But it wasn't enough to stop the momentum. On April 11, 1898, McKinley formally asked Congress for authority to intervene militarily in Cuba. Congress responded by passing a resolution that included something called the Teller Amendment, a promise that the United States would not annex Cuba once the conflict ended. On April 25, 1898, Congress officially declared war on Spain. What happened next surprised almost everyone, because the very first major battle of the Spanish-American War didn't happen anywhere near Cuba. It happened nearly 8,000 miles away, on the other side of the world, in the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey commanded the American Asiatic Squadron, a fleet stationed in Asia specifically in case war broke out. On May 1, 1898, Dewey led his ships into Manila Bay and engaged the Spanish Pacific Fleet. The result was a complete and total American victory. The Spanish fleet was destroyed, and remarkably, not a single American sailor died in combat during the battle. Meanwhile, on the ground in the Philippines, Filipino revolutionaries led by Emilio Aguinaldo had already been fighting Spain for their own independence, much like the Cubans had. Dewey's stunning victory proved that the modernized American Navy, which had been steadily built up over the previous 2 decades, was now a serious global force. Almost overnight, the United States became a major power in the Pacific. Back in the Caribbean, the war against Spain continued on multiple fronts. The U.S. Navy established a blockade around Cuba, cutting off Spanish supply lines and reinforcements from reaching the island. On land, American troops began landing near Santiago de Cuba, and this is where one of the most famous moments of the entire war took place. Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned his position in government to join the fight, led a volunteer cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders. On July 1, 1898, Roosevelt and his men, alongside regular U.S. Army units, charged up a fortified position known as San Juan Hill. The assault was costly, but ultimately successful, and it instantly turned Roosevelt into a national hero, helping launch the political career that would eventually take him to the presidency. Just days later, the Spanish fleet stationed in Santiago Harbor attempted a desperate breakout, trying to escape the American blockade. The American Navy intercepted them, and in the battle that followed, the entire Spanish fleet was destroyed. With their navy gone and their army collapsing on multiple fronts, Spain's position in Cuba had become hopeless. By August 1898, Spain agreed to an armistice, ending active fighting. The formal peace agreement, the Treaty of Paris, was signed that December. Under its terms, Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines directly to the United States. Cuba, meanwhile, was declared independent, technically fulfilling the promise made in the Teller Amendment. But in practice, Cuba remained under heavy American political and economic influence for years afterward. The entire war had lasted only about 10 weeks, a remarkably short conflict with massive consequences. Secretary of State John Hay famously called it a splendid little war, and in terms of cost to the United States, it was relatively cheap and quick. But there's a deep irony buried in this outcome. A war that began, at least in its public justification, as support for Cuban independence ended with the United States acquiring its own overseas colonies, becoming the very kind of colonial power it claimed to be fighting against. This contradiction wouldn't stay hidden for long. In the Philippines, the same Filipino rebels who had fought alongside the Americans against Spain soon found themselves fighting against their new occupiers in the Philippine-American War, a much longer and bloodier conflict that revealed just how complicated America's new role as a global power would really be.